There are over 25,000 unique cards in Magic the Gathering, but how many are truly unplayable in the Commander format? This video, I want to talk about a colorless spell that I think most players have completely overlooked: Warping Wail. Warping Wail is a 2-mana instant spell that costs 1 generic and 1 colorless mana. It's a modal spell, meaning you choose one of 3 options when you cast it: exile target creature with power or toughness 1 or less, counter target sorcery spell, or create a 1/1 Eldrazi Scion creature token. It has sacrifice this creature, add 1 colorless mana. When most people see this card, they stare at that colorless mana symbol and incorrectly assume that it is meant to be used in colorless decks. In fact, when you search this card up on EDH Rec, you'll see that nearly all of the top commanders currently using Warping Wail are colorless or Eldrazi. And that makes sense, because you can't cast this spell unless you have a source of colorless mana, which obviously you won't have unless you're playing a colorless deck, right? Wrong. There are so many powerful utility lands and mana rocks in the format that basically any deck can slot in enough colorless sources to play this card. I mean, let's think about it. First, you've got lands like Scavenger Grounds, Abstergo Entertainment, Demolition Field, Wasteland, etc. These cards can go into any deck as they provide graveyard hate and non-basic land hate, 2 things you should be playing in every deck. You might also be running some colorless mana fixers like Ash Barrens, Myriad Landscape, or one of the cycle lands for Modern Horizons. Throw in some pain lands like Llanowar Wastes and a couple Shadowmoor filter lands like Mystic Gate. Then, depending on your strategy, add in a couple more utility lands, maybe Rogue's Passage in a Voltron deck, or Arcane Lighthouse in a control deck, Buried Ruin in an artifact deck, Helios 1 in an energy deck, High Market in an Aristocrats deck, Field of the Dead in a landfall deck, or even Fountain Port in a token deck. Suddenly, without even trying, you've probably got close to 10 sources of colorless mana. And if you're not in green, or maybe even if you are, you're probably running some mana rocks like the Talisman Cycle, Mind Stone, or Liquimetal Torque. These also produce colorless mana. All told, if you want to run Warping Wail, it's not hard to find room for 15 or more sources of colorless mana in all but the most color-intensive decks. And according to a hypergeometric calculator I found online, if you have 15 sources of colorless mana in a deck, you can expect to draw one in your opening hand around 70% of the time. After 5 additional draws, this percentage jumps up to nearly 90%. Of course, going back to the original question, what decks actually want to play this card? Is it worth it? Let's find out. Warping Wail's first mode lets you exile any creature with power or toughness 1 or less. At 2 mana, that's not exactly a great rate. Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile, some of the most popular removal in the format, cost only 1 mana and have no restrictions. Blue and black also have much more efficient cards that exile creatures, like Baleful Mastery or Reality Shift. Red has several damage-based removal options like Flameblast Bolt or Smite the Deathlist, though these are fairly limited compared to other colors. And as far as I can tell, green is the only color that lacks instant speed options that exile a creature. Instead, green typically relies on various fight or bite cards like Tailswipe or Master's Rebuke. That said, it's important to remember that modal spells are almost always inefficient. You have to pay a little extra for the flexibility. So yes, Warping Wail's exile mode is less efficient and less effective, but it comes with the added versatility of its other modes. Okay, I'm actually getting ahead of myself here. Let's go back and talk more specifically about decks that can actually take advantage of Warping Wail's exile effect. Warping Wail is really good at sniping small, value creatures like Esper Sentinel, Essence Warden, or Disciple of the Vault, but there's actually a strategy that makes this effect even better: power and toughness manipulation. And I'm not talking about one-shot instants like Dizzy Spell, although it has Transmute, which is quite useful, or Downsides, which can be overloaded and again is quite useful. While I do think these cards are underrated, using them to lower a creature's power down to 1 or less and then exiling with Warping Wail is, well, it technically works, but it's a terrible idea. Instead, I'm looking at permanent and or repeatable effects that synergize with more than just Warping Wail. Cards like All-Seeing Arbiter, Silvergill Dowser, Watchdog, Boarded Window, Belb's Armor, Bone Flute, Anna Disciple, Ghosts of the Damned, Weakstone, Hunter of Nightveil, Dampening Pulse, Dega Disciple, Cumberstone, Azorius Skyguard, or Maysheen the Mind Cage. These cards all work within a kind of Pillowfort shell, but also make Warping Wail much more effective at exiling creatures. This strategy also synergizes with cards that swap a creature's power and toughness. If a creature has 0 power and you swap its power with its toughness, it dies immediately to state-based effects. There are a handful of one-of cards that do this. like Twisted Image, Reverse the Polarity, About Face, Inside Out, Twisted Reflection, Strange Inversion, Crook Claw Transmuter, Invert to Invent, and Transmutation. There are also a few repeatable options, like Manichi, the Fevered Dream, who can be a commander if you want to build something really janky, Dwarven Thaumaturgist, Merfolk Thaumaturgist, and Inversion Behemoth. Similarly, any Toughness Matters commander, like Arcades the Strategist, Phoenix God of Deception, or Ikra Shadiki, may be able to take advantage of these cards. Just be careful with your own creatures that have 0 power, as you don't want to inadvertently kill your own stuff. Other commanders that could lean into this theme include Tamio, Inquisitive Student, specifically the +2 ability on her Planeswalker side, Gregor, Shrewd Magistrate, who can switch his power and toughness after using Skulk to get past blockers, or Hapatra, Vizier of Poisons, who consistently is lowering power and toughness with -1/-1 counters. All of these commanders may already be running some of these cards, and can very likely take advantage of Warping Wail. I also want to mention 2 specific commanders that really should be running Warping Wail, and they probably aren't. Vati Ildal and Maha Its Feathers Knight. Both of these commanders, regardless of what else they're doing, set creatures' toughness to exactly 1, making it incredibly easy to get full value out of Warping Wail. According to EDH Rec, only 66 of 368 Vati Ildal decks are currently running Warping Wail. That's about 20%, which is definitely not enough. Maha, on the other hand, is way worse. Only 18 of nearly 3,000 decks are running Warping Wail. That's horrible. Maha players should be ashamed of themselves. And not just because they aren't playing Warping Wail, but also because they are playing Maha. I'm kidding, of course. You should play whatever you find fun. Let's move on to Warping Wail's second mode, Counter Target Sorcery Spell. And I want to start off with the obvious caveat that I understand this is a worse counterspell than pretty much any counterspell in blue, but this is colorless, can go in literally any deck. Obviously, you're not replacing a counterspell with this in your blue decks, but I mean it does counter spells and has no downsides, unlike some other non-blue counterspells like Mana Tithe or Tybalt's Trickery. In other words, if your deck needs more counter magic or protection and is not blue, please consider adding Warping Wail. Let's talk about a few cards that you can counter with Warping Wail. Pretty much every board wipe, including the ones that get around indestructible creatures like Farewell, Toxic Deluge, and By Invitation Only. If you've ever had a heroic intervention in hand when someone casts one of these board wipes, you understand why this is significant. It also counters pretty much every extra turn spell, including Expropriate. It counters most reanimation spells, including the lower mana value options like Reanimate and Victimize, as well as the mass reanimators like Eerie, Ultimatum, and Rise of the Dark Realms. It also counters dozens of game-ending spells like Finale of Devastation, Torment of Hailfire, or Approach of the Second Sun. Keeping these kinds of counter targets in mind, the decks that would most benefit from Warping Wail are likely go-wide strategies, which are typically weak to board wipes, and mill or discard strategies that can be weak to Reanimator. Commanders like Krenko Mob Boss and Sir Conrad the Grim come to mind. Finally, Warping Wail's last mode creates a 1/1 Eldrazi Scion creature token. Like before, you might think that the obvious synergy here is with Eldrazi. After all, they need a ton of colorless mana. The thing is, paying 2 mana and a card to essentially bank 1 mana for the next turn just isn't great. Strike It Rich, in comparison, does a similar thing for 1 mana, plus it has flashback, and it's still just okay in Casual Commander. And while making a 1/1 blocker at instant speed is a good option to have, there are several instant spells that are so much better at doing this. You've got cards like Artifact Mutation and Aura Mutation, which can snipe a problematic permanent and make several tokens, or Secure the Waste, which scales with your mana to make an obscene amount of tokens, or even Sprout Swarm, which has both Convoke and Buyback so you can loop it turn after turn. So you might be wondering, what decks might actually be interested in Warping Wail's final mode? The answer is Aristocrats. Aristocrats often overlap with token decks, the main difference being that instead of turning your tokens sideways, you're sacking them for value. As such, finding the right balance between tokens and sack outlets can be a challenge, especially because free sack outlets are prime targets for removal. That's why creatures that can sack themselves for free and at instant speed are very valuable. Even more so when you're not playing in black and your options for sack outlets are limited. With that in mind, here are a few commanders that I think could really benefit from Warping Wail. Gimli, Mournful Avenger. Shockingly, Warping Wail only appears in 38 of 914 decks according to EDH Rec. Any Lulu Loyal Hollyphant deck with a non-black background, Brutaclad Telcor Engineer. Not many people build him as an Aristocrat's commander, but considering he can turn all of your tokens into an Eldrazi spawn, I think it's definitely worth consideration. I also want to give a quick shout out to Ragadraga Gorgut's boss. Eldrazi Scion technically have a mana ability, turning Warping Wail into an instant speed 3/3, which is much more impressive. Okay, it's time again to circle back to the original question. Is Warping Wail unplayable? No. Warping Wail is severely underrated in my opinion. I give it 5 dumpster fires out of 7. It is not the most efficient card, as you'd expect for a modal spell, but each of its modes are surprisingly useful. And as a colorless card, it can slot into so many different deck archetypes that I'm honestly shocked it doesn't see more play. Seriously, give it a chance and see how it plays in your games. You won't be disappointed. At any rate, that's all for today. Let me know what you think of Warping Wail in the comments below, and feel free to leave suggestions for cards you want to see me review in the future. And of course, like and subscribe to help my channel grow. I'm having a lot of fun making these videos, and I really appreciate your feedback. Bye!